was a child, I was painfully shy. And this earned me many Best Listener awards and the status of being well behaved. I never got in trouble. But this good girl status that I had become so accustomed to was completely revoked at age 12 when I was sent to a very strict all-girls Catholic school. And on my first day, I learned that no matter how good I was, I would not be seen that way. We had a test on the first day, and my teacher was also the mistress of discipline. And she was everything you would imagine a mistress of discipline to be. She definitely wasn't warm and friendly. So after I'd handed my test in, I realized that I forgot to put my name on it. This was an innocent mistake, but little did I know that innocent mistakes were not tolerated here. So I stood up and I walked over and I asked for my test back. And to my great shock, I was scolded for having the audacity to stand up from my desk, and I was accused of trying to cheat. And I began bawling in front of a room full of my peers that didn't even know me yet. And they say that when we're shamed, we respond in one of two ways. We either internalize it and make it mean something about who we are, or we externalize it and we rebel against the person who is shaming us. I was not much of a rebel, but in retrospect, I wish I had been. For every time I was shamed, it tied a knot inside of me. And by the time I graduated 5 years later, I was tied in a million knots. And I remember in university, someone referred to me as the ice queen. And it was a joke, but it made me realize how tied up I was. I didn't know how to be natural. I couldn't share my opinions. I didn't even know I was entitled to have an opinion. I was very polite. I never got angry. But I also never got really excited or was really joyful. So fast forward into my early 30s, and a friend of mine recommended that I try Reiki, which is a form of energy healing. I had no idea what that was, but I was open-minded. And so after the session, the Reiki practitioner shared that many of my chakras were almost stopped. And she said she had never had to reset so many chakras all at once before. So before I left, with a look of concern on her face, she decided to teach me some exercises for releasing rage. Rage, I thought to myself, I could barely muster slight disapproval. I did not have rage. So obviously, she just didn't know me. So I listened politely, and I went on my way thinking I would never be in need of rage exercises. So about a week later, I was attending a baptism in a Catholic church. And it had been a really long time since I'd been to church. And I noticed that they had changed some of the responses and made them even more guilt-inducing. And this triggered something in me. So in the car ride on the way to the reception, I explained this to my husband. And being a Catholic himself, he got very defensive and he didn't seem to understand my concern. So I tried explaining the effect that this shaming had had on me as a child. And he still couldn't hear me. And all of a sudden, like someone had poured gasoline on a flame. I exploded. And this rage came over me that just could not be contained. And I began screaming hysterically. And the piece of paper that was in my hand with directions to the venue was torn up in a million pieces. And we were both shocked. I had never lost it like this in my entire life. I thought I was the master of my emotions. That moment was the beginning of my unraveling. And over the next few years, I had several other moments like that. And in between those moments, I began to become more in touch with my feelings. And as I released some of those heavier emotions, the lighter, the happier, and the more alive I felt. But I can't help but wonder if this had been happening even just a few decades ago, if I would have been labeled hysterical and placed in a mental institution. But as you can imagine, my sudden expressiveness created a lot of conflict in my marriage. My husband didn't understand what was going on with me. Suddenly, his calm, easygoing wife had become very outspoken. And just a few years later, the marriage ended. And also during this time, I was working as a teacher. And it was my job to manage my students' behaviors in order to keep order in the classroom. But as my knots were being untied, I couldn't help but notice how some of the well-accepted ways that I was managing their behavior was tying knots in them. So I began searching for better, more positive ways to manage their behavior. And while this was a step in the right direction, it wasn't the answer. The answer came from those moments when I had no choice but to let go of everything I thought I knew, all the rules, all the methods, all the strategies, and quit trying so hard to contain what couldn't be contained. And when I began to empathize with my students and give them opportunities to safely release what was tied up in them, that's when the biggest breakthroughs happened. And I think we're now at a time when more and more kids just won't be contained. And this rise in challenging behaviors amongst kids is something that many of us are concerned about. But I actually believe this has more to do with what we're doing right rather than what's going wrong. We are now wise enough to know that we can't keep using some of these long-term damaging methods that were very effective at managing kids. So now that we're choosing not to rely on fear and shame to manage kids, everything that has been contained and passed down from generation to generation is now safe to be released. And most of us didn't have a choice but to contain because it wasn't safe. So now that we understand what is really going on, it's time for us to find new ways to support kids in resolving, rather than just containing, what they're carrying inside of them that was passed down from us. And many of our deeply ingrained ideas around what's best for kids makes this really difficult to do. We need a whole new set of rules for this. So even though I'm still a teacher, I consider myself more of an undercover agent. Because when I go into schools, rather than teach kids how to contain and control what's going on inside of them, I help them untie their knots. And what I hope my story offers you is permission to allow your knots to be untied and to support those around you, especially kids, in this unraveling. Thank you.